So we are moving on to our second session of the day. And as a reminder, please use the Q&A function to send any questions. Our speakers for the next session are Nick Carbo and Amber Ruiz. Nick Carbo is a managing director at WTW. He has over 20 years of experience in the life and annuity industry. He is an industry annuity expert. He spent 7 years at Oliver Wyman as a senior principal and 1 year at Corbridge as the individual annuity chief financial actuary before joining WTW in 2025. He has expertise in modeling, experience studies, product development and pricing, M&A, Bermuda reporting, reinsurance, and in-force management. Amber Ruiz is a senior director at WTW. She has over 16 years of experience in the life and annuity industry. Since joining WTW in 2015, she has worked extensively across modeling, product development, valuation, and financial reporting. More recently, she has focused on outsourcing for a client with several annuity blocks, covering valuation under US GAAP and US statutory reporting. She has also experienced supporting litigation and expert witness engagements related to life and annuity products. Nick and Amber, thanks for being here. Over to you.
Thank you so much. Let me go ahead and share screen. All right. Hopefully people can see this.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right, thank you everyone so much for joining today. Nick and I are excited to walk through a little bit more about VM-22. We are kind of going to focus on a couple things. Number one, we are going to talk a little bit about the technical mechanics. We're going to try to get into the details surrounding actual case studies and implications of VM-22. But then we're also going to talk about practical examples. So how does this actually impact your business in practice? We're going to try to focus on a few things, really just like high level what's changing under VM-22. I know given the wide audience here, some of you may be more familiar than others with what VM-22 is, so we'll try to give a little bit of groundwork and background. We're going to talk about why it matters. We're going to talk about what companies can and should and are doing right now and going forward. And then again, we'll try to ground it in like real life examples. So we're not just talking pure theory, we're getting a little bit into the numbers as well. All right, so just first touching on the agenda briefly, we are going to start with details about planned adoption and considerations. So more about how does the industry stand today? What are companies thinking about as they go to adopt VM-22? Then from there, we will get into the reserve impacts. So that's going to be a bit more on the technical side, like understanding exactly what VM-22 is doing to reserves. And then lastly, we'll move more into pricing impacts. So that's going to be more of like the general business impacts, especially about pricing and overall strategy and what companies are thinking about and doing. So to start with details on adoption, on this slide and also a few others throughout our presentation, we have some industry data. So WTW performed an industry survey on the topic of VM-22 in like late 2025. We did get pretty good broad participation in this survey. So I'd say it covered around like 80% of the top 10 and top 20 fixed annuity and fixed index annuity writers. So pretty good, again, like broad representation with responses we got across the industry. I'll start first with the chart on the left side here. We asked companies when they are planning to adopt VM-22 for the range of products shown there. You can see that for most of it, based on the size of the circle, kind of indicates where the majority of responses are. But you can see that a lot of companies are adopting in 2028 or later. But we did see 12 of the 40 participants indicate that they plan to adopt VM-22 for at least one product in 2026. So I'd say it indicates companies plan to take a bit of a phased approach by product. Early adopters might be testing things out with one product here this year and then kind of phasing in with other products over time. kind of a mix like that. And then specifically, I did want to call out, so you might notice the circle there for FIA GLWB is noticeably larger, right, for 2026. There are 10 companies there that indicated they are planning to adopt for 2026, which does stand out versus the other products where you have less adopting this year. I did want to mention that just because a lot of those companies are smaller players. They're maybe just introducing the product. So I'd say for those 10, most of them are not like really big players in that product or that space, but just kind of ones that have a smaller market share in that product type. I do think that product is also notable to mention because you will see throughout our presentation, we do focus the analysis a lot on FIA with GLWB because that is the product type that is really known to have redundant reserves in terms of the reserve calculations now versus what it's going to be under VM-22. So a lot of the testing that we've done and continue to do is on that product type, which again, we'll walk through in more detail once we get into the case study kind of part of the presentation. And then let's see. So yeah, a lot of the other products you'll see companies deferring into 2028 or later. And then we did ask companies as well on the right side there if they are supportive of retroactive adoption. And as indicated in the dark purple color, you'll see that most companies said yes, they are supportive of optional adoption. There are a smaller number, that 6%, that said it should be required. And then the remaining, like about a quarter of respondents said they didn't think there should be retroactive adoption. Overall, of those that are adopting at least one product in 2026, pretty much all of them were supportive of optional adoption. I think the key message on this slide is really, even if you aren't planning to adopt until 2027, 2028, there's lots of preparation that needs to go into this now, right? Like for those that have been in the industry a while, you'll know that we've been talking about VM-22 for, I don't know, the last decade, maybe more. And so now it's finally here, it's finally coming. There is a lot that goes into it. And so even if you feel like, oh, I still have a couple years, you really need to start thinking about all these pieces now. And that is kind of segues well into this slide. So here we outlined some of the key considerations we feel like need to be thought of for implementation of VM-22. I'll go through each of these in more detail, but high level technology and tools. Do you have the technology you need, the speed, the capabilities, all of that? Experience and assumptions. So this is a really big one. Again, you'll see this more when we get into the numbers, but assumptions and your experience is really going to have a pretty big impact on the results coming out of VM-22 for your reserving. So important to spend the time on that. Governance, documentation, and controls. This is always a big one. I feel like as actuaries, we, are really into the numbers and the calculations and all of that. And so sometimes documentation and governance can get deferred or pushed off. I would caution that that's something you definitely don't want to do here. This is time consuming, but very important. So we'll get into those details. Strategic analysis, kind of some of the bigger decisions around when you want to implement, how you want to implement, and then the modeling approach. So like what software you're using, does that work? Are there bigger discussions that need to be had about how that's going to work for you? So overall here, I mean, implementation is really not just flipping a switch, right? Like it is going to require a lot of building these capabilities around all of these 5 key areas. All right, so to start with technology and tools, we outlined a few things here that we feel like need to be considered in terms of what technology you have, your tools, your model. In general, I would say that conversations we're having with companies, we really feel like VM-22 will be the impetus for companies reconsidering their modeling platform, kind of taking a step back and seeing, does this work for VM-22, or is this the time to have those broader conversations about moving or shifting somewhere else? So to start, performance is a huge one, right? we're in a world now where you are paying for performance, right? Like performance per dollar is key. You can do things, right? Like get more engines and more cores, and you can help distribute your runs on inner and outer loops and just all these pieces. But every part of that, it costs more money. So it's really a balance between optimizing how much you need, because there is an expense that comes with speed and the amount of technology. And I would say too, especially with like some of this stuff is just very computationally heavy, right? Like when we look at VM-22, we have things like stochastic on stochastic, and there's just a lot of technology that needs to go into running those things, the output, all of the pieces. And so efficiency can really be cost control here. The next piece is flexibility. So you need to make sure that you're able to model things at the granularity needed. So are you doing segment specific modeling where you have specific investment or reinvestment strategies that you're trying to model? You need to be able to analyze scenario specific results. You don't want to just have like an aggregate output and that's all you can see. You need to be able to get to the granularity level to set it up, to develop attributions, waterfalls, all that to perform the analysis needed. So again, it's seeing, do your tools allow that flexibility that you need? And then the last item we have noted here is on controls. So making sure that everything is as transparent and auditable as possible. Auditability, I'd say, is critical here, right? Again, the complexity is high. It raises the opportunity for additional questions to be asked, and you want to make sure that you can explain what you're doing and why you're doing it. And then automation. So automation of anything that's manual as much as possible. I think generally automation reduces operational risk. So you want to try to automate things where you can, and again, get all the controls set up appropriately. So here, really I'd say performance per dollar kind of almost becomes as important as model sophistication, but it's all a balance. So making sure you have the tools necessary for this. All right, next up, experience and assumptions. So here, experience studies really do matter. You're going to see under some of the results from VM-22 that company experience can significantly decrease reserves, especially for, certain product types that we're talking about here. So we listed a few key areas to consider in terms of your experience and assumptions. I'm sure there are others, but these are just a few of what we think are some of the more critical items. You want to be able to refine your experience study processes and frequency as needed. So determining if what you're doing right now works. Do you need to do it more frequently? Do you need to do it more granular? Do you need to do it on additional assumptions? Just kind of taking a step back again and looking at that process and seeing, does this still work for VM-22? You want to be able to leverage industry data to supplement any lack of experience you might have. So say your company is like a newer player in a space, maybe you're, just starting to offer a certain type of product or just something newer, then you want to make sure that you can supplement there with industry data if you don't have that data internally. Margin levels will depend on the credibility of your data. There is no binding SPA in VM-22, so assumptions matter when achieving reserve relief. You also want harmonized reinvestment strategy. Those assumptions will be key to aggregation benefits. And then the last item here just kind of goes back to what I was saying on the prior slide. All of this is going to be subject to additional regulator and auditor scrutiny. Again, there's just lots of changes happening here, so it opens the door for additional questions, and you want to make sure that you are able to answer those questions in terms of how you're setting your assumptions, what your experience shows, all of that. All right, governance, documentation, and controls. So again, modeling and documentation complexity emphasizes controls. So this stuff does get really complicated, and so you need to make sure that you have the infrastructure in place to control it, to document it, and I think sometimes we underestimate a lot of the time that can go into these pieces, and so you want to make sure you don't do that. You want to make sure that there's adequate time and revisiting things as needed as well. So again, just a few key areas to consider here. Number one, have you produced a VM-31 report? Again, this is an item not to be underestimated. It's not trivial, right? This is something that definitely can take time and effort, and so it's something you want to make sure that you are accounting for. What type of validation have the models undergone, and will it be revisited on a frequent basis? It's not something where you just want to do validation one time up front and then never do it again. It's something that needs to be continually assessed and monitored, and making sure that you're doing those validations frequently. Do the models have documentation and governance processes in place? Documentation always critical. I think especially, at companies, a lot of times there'll be rotation programs, or sometimes actual students will assist on models. And so those people that you have working on the models today might not be the people that are working on those models next year. And it's even more important for models that get really complicated, like these VM-22 models, to make sure that that documentation is there. So when those rotations happen or when turnover happens, you still understand, how does this model work? What is it producing, so that the next person can easily pick it up and make sure that everything is still working correctly. And then PBR documentation production strain is alleviated with process automation and tools. Again, automation tools are always something that can help us, but also need governance requirements in place to make sure that it's all working correctly. All right, strategic analysis. So this is getting at some of the broader, bigger questions, I would say. The couple that we have listed here are, when should we implement? And we discussed that briefly when we talked about the survey results and kind of saw who is implementing when, but it's a big decision, right? This is a big change. Companies need to have the resources in place to be able to implement and be comfortable with how they're implementing and its accuracy. And then, should we implement certain products earlier and others later? Again, there's a lot of strategy that goes into that question. Maybe we want to implement a smaller, easier product now, and then a more complex one down the road. Or maybe we want to implement one first where we feel like it's going to be more of a meaningful difference in the reserve, like it's going to bring the reserve a lot down. And then once we learn from that one, we'll do some of the others. Again, it's really going to be a company specific thing to see what works for them and see what makes sense in terms of what they implement, when they do it, and kind of the order of things. So again, a few key areas noted here. The first couple are more like asset related. So the first one there, asset allocation approach. Should we take a new approach to minimize reserve volatility? Should we leverage things like swaps for longer liabilities? I think it's just natural to, again, assess these things. What are we doing today? Does it still work, or does there need to be a change in approach? And then the second one is more general ALM approach. So duration management will become more important, especially with reinvestments being guardrailed. And so assessing, again, what we're doing for ALM today, does that still work, or do we need to change things down the line in terms of our strategies and management? Reserve volatility, so assessing that, actually kind of getting numbers in play and seeing how do things move. Is there extra volatility here? Comparison of existing US stat reserves and offshore solutions. So does our company have offshore solutions already in place? Or is that something we want to consider doing in the future? All of those, again, broader strategic decisions for changes that need to be made. AG 55 impacts, so the asset adequacy testing here for offshore, there's considerations around that. And then results compared to existing FINRE agreements. And then the last one we have is will some products pass the exclusion test? So kind of, again, just all broader, big things that need to be considered as we go through this. So overall, yeah, I mean, VM-22, there's a lot of strategic decisions that go into it. All right, so this one, I will emphasize, is a illustrative example, right? So these are not, we'll get more into specific numbers and runs and such later, but this one is more just high level trying to walk through an illustrative example of moving from AG33, what that can look like as we move from that to VM-22. This in specific is looking at an FIA product with GLWB. So I'll kind of walk through this step by step a bit. Starting on the left side, you can see like the premium coming in for the product. And then we go and we see the next one there is the AG33 reserve, which is quite a bit higher, right? And I think that just naturally shows the conservatism that is built into the existing AG33 structure. So from there, we have a waterfall that shows each of these different steps along the way. Does it increase the reserve? Does it decrease the reserve? And where do we ultimately end up at for VM-22? It is interesting because you can see most of the steps decrease the reserve, but there are a couple that notably increase it as well. The first one that we have noted there is assumptions. So we have it boxed just because you can see it is clearly the biggest impact, right? VM-22 uses best estimate assumptions. So like we talked about a few slides back, it's kind of why it's so important, like the analysis of the assumptions, the experience studies, all of that is really critical here because it is a huge driver of ultimately what your VM-22 reserve will be. On the AG33 side, you know, a lot of this was conservative in the past. The mortality was prescribed, which was pretty conservative. The policyholder behavior, you kind of went with like what was most optimal use, right? In terms of their surrenders, utilization of the WB, partial withdrawals, all of that. So kind of like a worst case situation. So it makes sense why you can see such a sizable difference there because those are two very different things, right? Best estimate versus that conservatism built in. The next one, so step 2 is on the discounting. So moving for VM-22 to based on the asset portfolio with those guardrails and scenarios. Prior AG33 was more static, defined by the regulation. So a smaller but still notable drop. And then the step 3 is the scenarios. So moving from a prior risk-free rate for AG33 over to the new scenarios. Step 4 and 5 are the ones that are a bit different, right? Because these actually increase it. So number 4 there, the NGE. So you move now to best estimate, again, for VM-22 versus AG33 was modeling at guarantees. So naturally lower versus our best estimate. And then expenses is an interesting one too. So expenses now based on actuals versus before were not modeled. So that also creates an increase. And then the last one is just more of like a measure, right? So VM-22 uses a CTE 70 across a set of scenarios versus AG33 was based on the highest PV of optimal policyholder benefits. So in that, it was more like, I don't know, 30 to 50 scenarios, I guess, commonly. So in general, the message here is the shift really fundamentally changes what drives reserves. You really have those assumptions being a key part here. And so, yeah, pretty notable. And then I guess I'd also just mention, like you look at the end here and you see, okay, where's VM-22 at? And you can see it aligns a lot better with the premium there on the far left, right? Versus AG33, what was significantly higher. All right, so switching a little bit, this slide outlines some of what WTW has done in this space. So we have done quite a number of things already in terms of modeling to get a handle around the changes coming and releasing these to kind of assist and guide the industry. All of our analysis is powered with our software. So you'll see this Risk Agility FM noted throughout our slides. That is our WTW software, which we have used for all of the analysis we have completed. And what we have shown here is just like a high level timeline of what we've done so far and then what is still to come. So I'll walk through each of these just kind of briefly. To start, so there's obviously also much before this. As I said, this has been going on many years, but our timeline here just kind of starts from what we've done so far starting this year. So starting at the beginning of this year, we were more focused on looking at baseline results. So really looking at that standalone stuff for different annuity products. So like MIGAs, FIA accumulation products, FIA with WB, and then also some PRT and SPIA. In March, we moved over to looking a bit more at asset impacts. So looking both at initial assets and also reinvestment allocations to better understand how those assets impacted VM-22 reserves. The one we have boxed there is June, so that's where we're at right now. The focus right now is more looking at guardrail impacts. So looking at different comparisons between the current guardrails, proposed guardrails, what it looks like if there's no guardrails, and all of those impacts. So then moving into the rest of this year, in August, the plan is we'll have more analysis focused on volatility. So getting a view of expected periodic volatility. And then later this year, shifting to Bermuda comparisons. So looking at Bermuda EBS for, I guess, at least one time period. And then looking at exclusion testing near the end of the year. So seeing how that could apply to base FIA and also MYGA products. Moving into early next year, we'll be looking more at hedging and then also aggregation. So throughout all these pieces, you might have already seen, we kind of like publish things as we go out to the industry, but definitely keep an eye out. There'll be more coming from us on this. And so with that, I'm going to pass it over to Nick. He's going to get into a bit more of the details and the numbers from what we've done so far in Risk Agility FM. If Nick is there.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now I can.
Okay. No, I appreciate the presentation here. Can you continue sharing the slides? Does that work?
Yes.
Perfect. Awesome. So yeah, as she noted, we've been sharing results, and this was really the first round back in January, and we had done some previews at a couple of presentations in the fall, finalized the results though, and kind of sent that package out to the industry. I think we sent it to like 150 clients and banks and whatnot in the industry to kind of just give everybody kind of at least a sense of what results could look like. And I think the key things here is there's probably 200 questions, and it could take you 20 years to try to figure out all the answers. But we've got a few years, and there's only so many questions we can answer. So what we're trying to do is help facilitate an understanding of how many moving pieces there are with VM-22 for the various blocks of business, with FIA income, as Amber noted, as like one of the key ones out there. But in this example, what we did was we took 12/31/2024 GOES scenarios, ran it through the VM-22 framework as of last year, and applied basically top 25th percentile for new business products. So we looked at what were like top cap rates for FIA products, what were the MYGA products looking like at that time, and leveraged that kind of as a starting place. And we ended up with reserves that were quite a bit lower for FIA income. The MYGA ones were a little bit higher. And I think, as we've refined results a little bit, there's been some movement on some of these. But effectively, SPIA also had a pretty big drive, but downward, but also at the same time, SPIA is not a big seller in the industry. So not a big one. I think the one that really calls home kind of, which is represented, I think, in slide 2 that Amber presented on the VM-22 survey. A lot of people are seeing the benefit from FIA income. Though most companies that are in that space have strong reserve financing or captive structures that have been set up to offset kind of that redundant reserve component, given the carbon reserves are quite a bit higher than the premium, and then VM-22 or the cash surrender value, depending on how you look at those lenses, where most of those that we're adopting are more of the players that have not been large in the space, re-entering the space, or maybe even entering the FIA income market for the first time. So that's kind of just a high level. On the right side, the blue, you talk about the field test. So there was a field test run by the industry, and then there was a model office developed as part of that. Our results were pretty close to those. And then the participant average, I think the big one there effectively is that there's like a range of results across the industry, and the way that they applied it to historical enforced business maybe is not going to give you the same answer, especially given that there's going to be all these questions around kind of what Amber had noted, those things that we're trying to help answer over time, which is like, what about the product generousness? How does it compare to Bermuda? How does it compare when you think about changes in the scenarios, and kind of all the moving pieces that are within the framework. And we were just looking at some of that stuff just last night, and saw some pretty big changes as, you know, even just move scenario time periods, how your generousness of your products come through, how you set your assumptions are a big driver too. So there's a lot of moving pieces to this. So if we can move to the next slide. Looking here was trying to think of ways that we could visualize results and try to be able to explain them. So on this scatter plot, we've got on the x-axis, we've got the change in the the 5-year US Treasury since issue. So for the MYGA, this was a 7-year MYGA. Reinvestments kind of start around that year 5-ish. And so if they're reinvesting, you would assume that they're reinvesting at lower rates. The upper left side, that your GPVAD would be higher there, whereas if interest rates had increased, you know, your GPVAD would be lower. So you'd be reinvesting at a higher rate, and it would be a combination of that, and you'd have probably lower lapses during the shock period, and have a little bit more spread going forward to support that too. So effectively, it would give the benefit of higher earnings, but also a higher discount rate in the calculations too. So what we saw here was, you know, the move in the reserve seemed pretty reasonable given this. We did also look at it under a number of different lenses and look in different treasury periods, what the change in the treasuries were at different points in time too. And you see a pretty high correlation in the GO scenarios, at least the few time points that we've looked at it, between a lot of the treasury rates, but there is inversion that occurs in the scenarios too that can distort results and make it look a little hard to look at results. So again, this is just one of the ways that we looked at it. We'll jump ahead to the next slide. This one was on the FIA income. So on the top, similar view, but we looked at the 5-year US Treasury at year 10. So just kind of, hey, when the end of the surrender charge period comes up, we invested for about a 10-year horizon over this product with reinvestments occurring at that point. So that would be a pretty big determinant there. Also a factor with with some shock lapses occurring in our model. And then on the bottom, you'll see the wealth factor. So that's just looking at like a 10% FIA cap, which is what we effectively modeled for most of this. And the higher the wealth factor, the higher the growth in the FIA account, this is over a 10-year period, the lower the results would be, right? Because you'd have less claims occurring. There'd be more account value to support it when equity growth is stronger in the bottom right versus when equity growth is weaker in the upper left. And there's a pretty big correlation with that. Now, some of that could be the way that we model it. Again, this is another question you can kind of pose to yourself, which is, well, how do you want to model your hedging, or how do you want to hedge going forward under VM-22? Currently, our modeling is just hedging the account value index credits. And so that kind of effectively overhedges it slightly, you would say. And if you were to hedge on a holistic basis, how would that change results? Maybe it would give you a higher reserve, maybe not. Maybe it would have results that are more consistent with your change in reserve from period to period. I think there's a lot of drivers there, but things to think about kind of going forward. We can jump to the next page, Amber. So under SPIA, similarly to like the FIA income, you know, when we look at those decreasing rates, those tend to be the binding constraints. And again, it's like we're looking at 1 point on this. So at the 10-year, at year 20, so when there's a big reinvestment portion, that's when we see driving a lot of the results here, because the liability is pretty long. I think we had like a 62 issue age or early 60s for the policy. So there's definitely a large margin of policies that still exist at year 20 out there. We can jump ahead to the next one. Okay, so changing results a little bit here, kind of what we looked at here, which was kind of Amber talked about this with what we released back in March, which was looking at different tenors. So we went something kind of extreme here, where the pink bars were looking at just like a 2-year floating rate asset. So I just kept reinvesting at 2 years at a floating rate asset. And then the green bars were looking at, hey, what if I went a little bit longer on my asset strategy? And then the purple bars in the middle was kind of my baseline. So if we look at the products that are kind of like what I guess I viewed as pass-through of the credited rate. So the MIGA 3s, there's not a lot of duration difference there. And then we look at the FIA accumulation, like we basically held a 2% product spread across the life of the policy. So if interest rates rose, we passed out the policyholder. If interest rates dropped, the policyholder was impacted by the drop in the rate. So depending on how you model that, it could give you different results. What we did notice is when you had more guaranteed products or period products that had more guarantees for a longer period of time, being a little bit longer was actually beneficial, at least in this interest rate scenario, right? So this was 12/31/2024. And if we look at the next slide, Amber, I believe we've got the distribution of the scenarios. We don't. Okay. So I guess I'll speak to it high level, but like the interest rate scenarios have like a distribution of like some are going to be increasing rates, some will be decreasing rates, somewhere in the middle. As we looked at 12/31/24, there was more kind of declining rates. We recently looked at 3/31/26, and it was almost higher increasing rates. So if you have a lower treasury, it appears like that it's kind of using a mean reversion that maybe brings it back to some consistent level. So if rates are lower, it's going to have more mean reversion upwards, and then if it's higher rates, it's going to have a mean reversion slightly down in rates. So it kind of keeps it more stable, I guess, over time. So these results would differ how you invest each period. So if you're too long or too short, it's going to give you different results based on the scenarios and the starting treasury rates at that time. So I think we can jump to the next slide, which I guess this drills a little bit into this as of 12/31/24, which was looking at the short, which is in the pink again, and the green some long, and then baseline is in purple. So ideally, if you're well matched, the way I kind of think about this is that this would show kind of like a level set of dots, right? That it doesn't care what your reinvestments or how interest rates change in the scenario, is if you're well matched on your assets. So you'll see in like the green there's kind of that positive slope. So like you're definitely doing much better when when interest rates drop, whereas if interest rates rise, those tend to be the binding scenarios. So it kind of like flips that state where if I'm short, I'm worse if I'm effectively when interest rates drop, right? So it's kind of the opposite paradigm there. And the purple one, we're kind of pretty well matched, I guess we call it. That is more like level, right? It's not so much dependent on the interest rate scenario as more so the path of the interest rate scenario as opposed to like the general trend of the scenario. So that it's kind of interesting how that plays out. I think it'll be interesting to see how this plays out as we look at different dates too, and how that impacts the results differently. So if we jump to the next one, I think we've got similar here with the FIA accumulation, maybe a little less of the slope impacts, but we kind of noted that there's the benefit where we're passing through effectively any changes in the yield to the policyholder. So if interest rates change pretty dramatically, it's going to go right to the policyholder's credited rate or their option budget for the product. So being long can be not as beneficial, being short can be not as beneficial. Really, it seems like the best one seems to be kind of keeping it consistent with the surrender charge period of that 10-year investment period. So we use like a 2-year for the short, and this one I believe was a 15-year for the long period. And then later on, there's kind of like these highlighted green, yellow, and red circles around some of the scenarios. What we were trying to do there is kind of zoom in and see what the net cash flows look like, just to understand like what's actually happening in each one of these scenarios, right? So you start to peel the onion back of all this, and there's a lot of drivers of things, and so that's what we're just trying to explain at a high level here, but then kind of drill into the deeper piece. So we'll touch on that in a few minutes. If we want to jump to the next one, Amber. Okay, so the FIA income, definitely a wider range of results, and some of that's due to the equity scenarios, which we kind of noted in the prior set of slides on kind of that baseline results. But now we kind of see here is that the long is actually more beneficial. So what does that mean? I think that means that we probably had too short of an asset strategy initially. They all seem to have a negative slope. I mean, maybe the green is a little bit more level, hard to tell exactly with all the dots. There's a lot moving around. Even if we put regression lines, it becomes tricky to see those even there. So, but overall, it seems like we probably should have been a little bit longer. But I think that can help influence kind of how you think about the duration of the product too, how you look at this kind of reinvestment impacts. We can jump to the next one. I think we've got another. Yeah, so this one looks at the equity scenarios, which I think is really quite interesting to see how powerful this equity return aspect is. So we look at, in the upper left is the baseline, upper right is long, and then the short is in the bottom left. And the legend for all these dots. So this is again the same as the 5-year Treasury change from issue to duration 10. So at that kind of that reinvestment point largely, or key point of the reinvestment. You've got the high in those dark greens, right, which tend to not be the binding scenarios. They're very low for the most part. And then if we look at kind of the low mediums of pinks and light purples, those tend to be the binding scenarios because you have so much lower equity performance. And then kind of that medium high kind of falls to the bottom also. You do see a lot less correlation, it seems like, on the short strategies because the investment income takes over so much because you've got so much variation in the investment income, as opposed to if you've got a more stable earned rate, the driver is going to be more of the equity changes from period to period. So it's kind of interesting how that plays out a little bit there. We can jump to the next slide. I think there's a couple more we want to go through. Yeah. I think you were going to touch on this one, Amber, right? Go through the pricing impacts piece.
Yep. So I guess switching a little bit back now to pricing impacts. So this is kind of the last thing we wanted to walk through as noted up front. I do think kind of one interesting stat to call out related to pricing is when we talked about in the beginning some of the survey results and we saw all the companies implementing in 2026. It's notable that those that are adopting in 2026, even if just for one product, only about 20% of them indicated they had even looked at pricing impacts yet. So even though they are implementing it, it just shows that there's still a lot of work and analysis that still needs to be done here in terms of pricing. So what we have on this slide is we outlined those same 5 key considerations that we showed earlier, but a couple of them we have grayed out. The ones we have highlighted are the 3 that we feel like are most important, like the biggest pressure areas, and that would be the technology and tools, the strategic analysis, and the modeling approach. So similar to previously, I'll kind of walk through each of these and talk through some of the key areas of focus we feel like companies need to look at. So to start is the technology and tools. Again, here there is a big trade-off between modeling speed and cost and the various analysis that your tools can do. So just to start is with speed and cost, again, companies are considering, do I need a new modeling platform? Is the one I have right now good enough? Can it do what I need? Do I have enough budget to run these models, right? Again, it can be very computationally heavy for all the data that needs to run through these things. So it can add up quickly when you're paying per use. Number 2 is the data storage, making sense of stochastic on stochastic results. I've seen companies in the past that have built really sophisticated stochastic on stochastic models, not even talking VM-22, just talking generally for other purposes. And they create these really fancy, great models and all this data comes out and then no one can make sense of it, right? And so that's definitely something you want to avoid. You want to make sure that you have the tools you need to be able to understand what's actually coming out. But then you also need to make sure that you have the tools to actually store this data. And so I think with this, one thing that some companies are looking at is, do I need to project stochastically? Can I maybe do some type of approximations instead for a pricing perspective? So just some things to be thinking about in terms of all the data and the technology needed for that. For the go scenario, how do we develop model results with restrictions around the scenarios? And then model validation, how can we best validate the model is performing as expected? Again, you don't want to just validate one time up front and then forget it. You want to make sure that you're continually looking at things and making sure that as things change or, as you create a new model or a new product or change assumptions that things are still working as expected. And then lastly, explaining actual reserves versus priced for reserves. So reserves will be impacted by actual assets that are purchased. So it can lead to a difference in like the reserve that is booked versus what you're seeing in the pricing model. So something that you want to make sure that you're aware of and can help explain in case there are divergences there. This next slide again goes back to some of the survey results. And so this one, we asked companies a bit more about their model run times in the survey. And we tried to get it on an equal playing field, right? Because some companies have a lot more model points, or some are running a lot more scenarios, or have additional cores. And so we didn't want to just compare it as is, because that's not fair, right? So what we did was come up with this calculation that you see on the right side. It's essentially model points per hour per core for just one scenario. And so that kind of gets everything on like an apples to apples comparison in terms of the data that's being run. I did want to mention the various participant responses here. So there's 11 of them shown, but it does cover across most of the large modeling systems. So things like Profit, Polysystems, Alpha, Axis, like all of those various iterations are covered. And then, as noted before, we have done all of our analysis so far in our software, Risk Agility FM. So we do have that one up at the top corner. As you can see, it is just faster, which I think has been really helpful for our analysis. And it's also been, I think, eye-opening to some of the companies that we've been talking to that it can be very concerning if your models are running really slow or it's really expensive to try to speed them up. You think about pricing, and it's a very iterative process, right? Like you make a change, you need to run the models again. And if every time you're running the model, it's taking hours or days, that can't be a very efficient process. So something to think about, and an interesting comparison, I would say. The next one, we are talking about strategic analysis. So looking at the timeline and product revisions that potentially need to be made for pricing. So companies are looking at products specifically and thinking, okay, do we need to move to certain products, or do we need to change product designs? Do we need to look at other solutions? Like, is our existing reinsurance that we have working? Is there something better that can address any reserve concerns that pop up from VM-22? Model development, can we develop models fast enough to allow us to implement once a decision is made? And then product modifications, like I mentioned, like not only should we be moving away from certain products, but like should we be discontinuing some entirely? Do we need to develop new products? I think that one ties in nicely with the chart we have shown on the right side. And so what we have shown here is just kind of one example of a product and how the structure of it would work in VM-22. This one is an FIA product with a GLWB, and it has one of those like stacking roll-up designs where it kind of depends on the market performance of the index credits. And so you can see there in the dark purple, the AG33 reserve in this case is actually lower than the VM-22 reserve. And that is because the AG33 projects the future option budget at the guarantee level, as opposed to like the projected option budget level, which you can see there in the orange. So it results in a different reserve, again, based on the product design. So just something to consider in terms of the impacts are going to be different based on the product structure and design. And then the last one, new reinsurance solutions. So should we investigate new reinsurance solutions or discontinue what we're doing? So again, just taking like a step back here and looking at some of the broader decisions that need to be considered and made ultimately. And then this one is more related to the modeling approach. So for our pricing, how do the changes need to be implemented? For the projected reserve methodology, do I need to do a full inner loop stochastic set for pricing? For the NGEs, should renewal rates be modeled when assets are guardrailed? For sensitivity, should there be new census sensitivities? Do I need to run the same ones I've been running? Do I need to run more or less? Is that going to be more computing power? And then for assets, how will I handle assets? Do we need more sophistication, right? Do we maybe have simplified asset assumptions right now and we need to build out additional capabilities within the model? So all these things are questions that kind of need to be answered in terms of pricing. We do have, again, an example kind of shown there on the right side. For this one, the company's net yield assumption is shown as like a flat 6%, whereas the VM-22 yield is more of like a sloping upward from 4 and up. And so you can see the VM-22 modified budget then ends up more of a slope as opposed to the best estimate of, which is just the flat across the board. And so the point here is that using the same spread under VM-22, it can understate the option budget relative to the best estimate. So can have different impacts based on what we're looking at. And so with that, we just have a few key takeaways. I know we've covered a lot here, but just highlighted a few things that I think are big takeaways from the various pieces. Number one, VM-22 may require a new modeling software. Again, this goes back to the runtimes versus the costs, really doing that assessment of the model we have right now. Is it working? Do we need to do an overhaul, find a new modeling platform? Are there modifications that need to be made to what we have? You also want to analyze current reserves versus VM-22. So kind of looking at those differences and figuring out what works for our company in terms of election, both in general and then also in terms of which products win. And then lastly, asset and ALM strategies are expected to change for products reserved under VM-22 to limit reserve volatility. So thinking through those and what you're doing for assets and your ALM. So yeah, I mean, overall, VM-22 is a pretty big transformation, right? It really hits across all things. It touches modeling, strategy, pricing. It's not just a regulatory change. And again, it's not going to be just a fast, quick, easy thing. It's going to be something that really requires a lot of time and consideration and decisions. So with that, I don't know if we have any questions. So I guess we can go.
Yes, we have two questions that came in through the Q&A. The first one is, what modeling platforms are companies mostly considering?
I can speak to that one. Can you hear me? Awesome. Yeah, no, I think the two biggest ones right now have been risk agility and Pathwise. Just given the runtime speed of both of them, I think I don't want to make this a risk agility commercial too much. Maybe we did a little bit, but I think that there's definitely pros and cons to every system out there. I think a lot of the existing systems have some runtime concerns and just some of the flexibility concerns are a concern a lot in the industry at the moment. So those are the two biggest that we've seen based on our survey, and we plan to do that survey again in August to try to get a 6-month view of what's happening on VM-22 and kind of as people are pivoting as regulation is changing. There was even a guardrail update back in March. There's more pieces I'm sure that will come through as we move forward.
The next question is, for those who are newish to the industry, how often do big changes to core actuarial tools / models occur, and what are your favorite sources to learn more and keep up to date?
I guess I'll take this one too quickly. I think it's like probably every 10 to 15 years, softwares have been changed, and I think it is kind of a question of will that change with like AI and different types of new technology that comes through, right? Potentially, actuaries tend to be a little bit slower in their uptake of new technology in some ways, but also just change in general. Very cautious and careful on decision making and that kind of stuff. I think getting up to speed, some of it really just comes down to, we're definitely willing to talk about risk agility. I'm sure every other platform provider would share their insights to you also.
That's all of the questions that we had.
Okay.
I've got one more coming in. Is AI playing a role in VM-22 or risk agility?
Do you want to take it, Amber?
Yeah, so I would say within risk agility, I can answer that we are trying to implement AI tools to assist. So they are currently kind of, I'd say, under development, but we have really great tools which are actually pretty profound, right? Like I remember back as an actuarial student, a lot of the time is spent like learning an actuarial software, but it's gotten to the point where a lot of these tools can assist with a lot of that. And so in some cases, you don't really even have to open the software anymore. You can kind of talk to this AI assistants that can help program and do debugging and all of that for you. So it's really cool. A lot of them, again, are still in development, but I think it could be a really great, helpful thing to make all this, process faster and smoother and our lives easier. But yeah, TBD, I guess.
Yeah, no, I think AI has been the hot topic lately, and to Amber's point, like we have the AI system built into like our coding system today. It's kind of like one of the newer things within the last 6 months or year, but it's definitely resonated a lot with clients. We've had a lot of discussions about it, and it's very helpful to like understand how the code works or how to make adaptations to it. And then further, we have like something kind of like in the beta phase right now, but where it will actually build models. So like we give it in product specs and things like that, called AI Companion, and it'll actually start building out the whole model. So we've got demonstrations of that we've done for a lot of companies. And while we did the risk agility tour earlier this year, 3 or 4 months back, that was a big discussion topic. And I think as we get more and more technology moving here, I think we've went all in AI. I think some of the other platforms maybe have not as much as we have at this point.
Yeah. And I'd say like another cool thing I've seen is like I guess within ours and just others that I've seen as well is the documentation. So we have a pretty cool tool that like builds out at least a first cut of like documentation of the whole model for you. It's not going to be perfect, right? There's going to definitely still be some like human intervention that needs to review and add to it. But I know that documentation is something that a lot of us struggle with, right? It's not the most fun part of our work. And so if you can have an AI tool that can help at least get a first cut at that for you, again, it saves us time. And I think that's a really great piece that I've seen as well in development.
Okay, so we've got some more questions rolling in. I think we might have time for one or two more. We have 3 actuarial software is in-house already. Should we get a new one or build something in-house?
I think it's always a debate, right? I think it's how quickly can you convert to a new software, or is there flexibility? How do you think about that? I think is an important one. I think it's worth balancing that. Is the existing ones, can you segment off a block of business even to, and is there ways? I think the other ones that we've spent a lot of time talking about personally has been how do you like streamline the processes and things like that too. So a lot of opportunities there to kind of operationalize the modeling efforts and things like that too. If there's another question, we'll take more.
Oh, sorry, I was muted. Yes, the last question. Did you test the impact of using offshore reinsurance?
That is down the road. We are planning to do that in the near term future here.
Okay, well, if there's no more questions, I think Phyllis, you could wrap us up if she's around.
Sure. Well, this concludes our day 3 of our spring 2026 spring meeting. We will continue our day 4 tomorrow, the same time, 11 a.m. Central. So hope to see you there. Have a nice day.